Was just thinking about how she should avoid drinking tea and going on balconies. I don't think Putin would have any reservations about killing one of his own if they criticize him.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today I've had Sir Bill Browder on the show. We've spoken about this deadline from Donald Trump. His 10 to 12 day deadline for Vladimir Putin to end the war is up this week. His deadline for India is also up on Thursday, so we speak about that. The Telegraph is reporting that India could end the war in Ukraine if they chose to be on the side of the US and its allies. So we speak all about that. We speak about what the alternative is to lowering these oil prices so that it hits Russia where it hurts. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube, or you can stream us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
Well, we'll start off with CNBC had an interview with Donald Trump on Tuesday. He lashed out at Russia. He said Putin will stop killing people. If you get energy down another $10 a barrel, he's going to have no choice because his economy stinks. So is there a way that Donald Trump is proposing to lower these oil prices other than by threatening sanctions? Is it almost worth increasing production in the United States or even asking countries like Brazil and Canada to up their oil production?
Well, I mean, Trump is. I've been critical of Trump's approach towards Russia since he's been president in his second term. But what I would say is that he's hit the nail on the head. That if Russia doesn't have the money to carry on the war, then they'll finally be in a position to negotiate. And the one place that they continue to get money after all these sanctions is with the export of oil. And if Trump's policies succeed in getting the oil price down, or alternatively in cutting Russia off from the sale of oil, I mean, the oil price generally doesn't have to come down. All it has to do is come down for Russia. Then he's absolutely right that Russia would be forced into the corner and into a position where they have to negotiate and potentially cease fire.
Is it worth Trump pressuring private US sellers to sell oil to India at a discounted price? Or do you think this is essentially going to be too expensive and too much admin for India to move away from cheap Russian oil, especially because they're reselling it and refining it, Bill?
Well, I mean, it's all a zero-sum game. India wasn't buying a ton of Russian oil before the war began. And all of a sudden, all this cheap oil became available, and they bought, I think the estimates are like $350 billion worth of Russian oil since the war began. And so India could easily find other sources of oil. I don't think it's our place to replace cheap Russian oil with cheap American oil. I think that the Indians should just go and find oil somewhere else and at the regular market price, like everybody else has to pay. And it's not as if we owe India that. India is taking advantage of the war to get cheap Russian oil, and in doing so, they're funding the war, which they shouldn't be doing.
Trump's deadline to strike a new trade agreement with India and for them to walk away from buying Russian oil and buying weapons is Thursday, August 7. That is tomorrow. The US president has said that he plans to raise the 25% tariffs on Indian imports very substantially within 24 hours. So how likely is it, Bill, that you think Narendra Modi will attempt to work something out with Trump?
Well, sadly, from the perspective of being tough on Russia, there is the famous acronym TACO, Trump always chickens out. And you remember there was like 150% tariffs on China, and now, it's been, the deadlines have been postponed. I mean, it's kind of hard for me to imagine that Trump is not going to somehow chicken out here. But if he doesn't chicken out, this could be a game changer as far as Putin's ability to fight this war is concerned.
The Telegraph reported yesterday that India could end the war in Ukraine tomorrow and that Modi needs to pick a side. Do you agree with that, Bill? You and I haven't spoken so much about India's involvement until the last few weeks when this deadline was implemented from Donald Trump. But is this correct? Is India either the saving grace in this war or the catalyst to keep it going?
I think that there's a lot of truth to that statement. I would add that there's a few other countries that are also buying Russian oil. There's China, that's Turkey. Um, those countries should also stop buying Russian oil. But India is a big part of it. As I mentioned, it's like they provided $350 billion worth of cash since the war began. And the war has cost a lot of money for Russia, and they've used a lot of that $350 billion to buy weapons and to pay soldiers and so on and so forth. Russia really doesn't have anything else other than oil. There's a few other minor exports, but if oil was cut off, then Putin would be forced to negotiate. He'd have no choice. He'd run out of money.
Is it worth the US and EU sanctioning India at all, do you think? That we know that the EU sanctions against India's oil refinery, Nayara Energy, has significantly disrupted their operation.
Well, I think that the Europeans, who have more at stake in this war than the Americans, would love to sanction all the countries that are buying the Russian oil, but they can't do it by themselves. And so, together with the United States, this would be a game changer. It would absolutely, completely change the tone of the war. You know, Putin doesn't want to end this war. He thinks he's got the advantage. He doesn't care about the number of soldiers he loses. He doesn't care about the short-term economic costs, because he believes, and he might be right about this, that he can endure 100 times the pain that we can, because he's a dictator. He doesn't have to worry about public opinion, whereas every one of our leaders does. And so he can do everything and anything. But the one thing he can't do is, if he doesn't have the money, he can't afford to buy the weapons. He can't afford to pay the soldiers, and his war would have to come to an end. And so this is a crucial and decisive moment, and how it gets resolved could determine whether the war ends or not.
Trump's 10 to 12 deadline for Vladimir Putin, it ends on Friday. Otherwise, Russia risks further secondary sanctions and tariffs. But Trump's Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff will travel to Moscow either today or tomorrow to embark on a fourth round of talks with the Kremlin. Now, Trump said that we've got to get a deal. But Bill, how confident are you that this ultimatum from Trump has paid off at all?
Well, I've read the reports this morning that Putin is ready to offer some type of air ceasefire. In other words, stop sending drones and missiles into Ukraine. And his and I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, it's a kind of a complicated compromise, because the way in which Ukraine is defending themselves is with drones on the battlefield. And so if Russia says we'll do an air ceasefire, and then Trump looks to Ukraine and says, will you do an air ceasefire? And they say, well, I don't know. I mean, if they were to do that, then the Russian soldiers could basically run across the border. And so it's, I don't know what's going to happen in Moscow. The most likely scenario is that nothing happens in Moscow, that Putin talks nice. And so Putin with Trump and actually with other presidents has this thing where they all want to reset their relations with Russia. We saw this with Obama. We saw this even with Biden. Everybody wanted to reset their relations with Russia. Putin knows how to talk nice, and so these presidents think, "Oh my, I'm really getting through to this guy," and then he does nothing different than what he's always done before. And I don't know what's going to happen with Steve Witkoff in Moscow. I'm sure that Putin will talk very nicely and talk about all sorts of processes and discussions and task forces and so on and so forth. But I can't imagine that Putin has any intention of ending the war. And so then the question is, can Putin offer some nonsense like an air ceasefire, which gives Trump some ammunition to go back and say, look, I negotiated this great deal, when in fact Putin actually set a trap for the Ukrainians.
Well, what if Witkoff comes back from Moscow to the United States with no advancements in peace talks, no concessions from Russia, and Donald Trump is then left to actually put his money where his mouth is and say, "Look, I'm going to implement these tariffs on Russia." Do you see that happening, Bill, or do you see Trump more likely setting another deadline?
Well, if we look at this deadline, the deadline that was set was the fifth deadline that Trump set since, or I should say, the fifth ultimatum that he set since the whole thing began. And so I think it's more likely than not that he'll set a sixth ultimatum. But who knows? I mean, Trump is unpredictable. That's his great foreign policy skill, is just being a wild man, and perhaps, perhaps he'll do what he's supposed to be doing here. I'm not betting on it. I think that's everything we've seen up until now suggests that he doesn't particularly want to be tough on Putin. From the very beginning, he's given Putin a pass at almost every juncture. And you remember when the United States was voting with Russia at the UN against resolutions condemning the invasion. I mean, there's been so many features. There's been so many incidents where Trump has sided with Putin that it's kind of hard to imagine that he will have just radically in 180 degrees change. If he has, he's got all my support. If he hasn't, we're right back where we were before.
If Trump doesn't follow through, Bill, how do you think the EU and fellow NATO allies should respond? Should they be continuing to funnel all energy into providing Ukraine with more weapons?
Well, I mean, the war for Europe is an existential war. If Putin succeeds in Ukraine, his next move is Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are members of the EU and NATO members. If that happens, then Europe is not just funding a war; Europe is at war in order to abide by their NATO agreements, and therefore Europe has to do whatever it has to do to keep Russia from succeeding. And it would be nicer for Europe to have America on side. It's a good development to have Trump issuing these ultimatums. Let's see what happens tomorrow.
Bill, Russia seems to have declared that there are now no limits to this war. The Russian Foreign Ministry said that the West is creating a direct threat to the security of our country, and Russia no longer considers itself to be constrained by anything. Therefore, Russia believes it has the right to take respective steps if necessary. So what kind of credible threats do you think Russia is actually saying that they would impose on the United States and allies?
Well, if you remember, since the beginning of the war, they've alluded to the fact that if things get too bad, they're going to launch a nuclear strike. That's been their sort of the nuclear saber rattling. And it was off the back of that President Biden, when he was president, didn't want to escalate. He didn't want to do things that would be provocative to Russia. And so Russia has been riding off of the vapor trails of their nuclear saber rattling since the beginning of this war. They've never actually taken any steps to launch a nuclear strike, and they understand that if they did so, there would be mutually assured destruction. That's why there hasn't been a nuclear war up until now. And so they can continue to throw this out there in the hopes that everybody will cower and then try to appease Putin. But Putin is a man who only understands one thing, which is raw strength. And so we should give the Ukrainians what they need to continue to push Russia back. We shouldn't alter our position one bit. And there are two ways that we can help the Ukrainians. One is with weapons, and the second is with sanctions. And this latest development of cutting off Russian oil effectively by telling anyone who buys Russian oil that they're going to be in deep economic trouble if they do so is a very strong step if it's followed through.
According to a German newspaper, Bill, Putin's secret love child, a 22-year-old art graduate living in Paris, she shared some pretty brutal messages about her supposed father on Telegram. Well, she didn't name Putin. She alluded to the man who took millions of lives and destroyed mine. It's liberating to be able to show my face to the world again. It reminds me of who I am and who destroyed my life. Now, just for context, she had a bit of somewhat of a social following a few years ago, and then basically completely went off the grid as soon as the war broke out. She used to have a very luxurious social presence, showing yachts and planes and blah, blah, blah. And now she's back and she's condemning the war. So it's an interesting turn of events, Bill. But what was your reaction to this?
Well, I was just thinking about how she should avoid drinking tea and going on balconies. I don't think Putin would have any reservations about killing one of his own if they criticize him.
You really, I mean, looking at the photos, Bill, she literally actually does look like Vladimir Putin, apparently born in 2003. But Do you think that because you're someone that really knows the mind of Vladimir Putin and has spent a lot of years trying to get inside that head, do you think that her public criticism of him and his war would actually upset him?
I think it would. I think it's a very comparable situation to the Crown Prince of Dubai and all of his daughters who were speaking out, and how then he had the Crown Prince kidnapped them and kept them in armed compounds and fed them with antidepressant drugs so that they all calmed down. I'm sure that Putin is thinking the same thing. People are very hard to control, but all these dictators really know, that when they're unconstrained by rules, they really know how to control everybody.
So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.